Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. As the dust settles in riot-torn Britain, is the country more divided than ever before? With thousands taking part in protests and counter-protests, social media seems to have whipped up tensions. So how will Prime Minister Keir Starmer handle the response to the riots? Although he's keen to show he's tough on crime, he's facing an overcrowding crisis in Britain's prisons. And the right wing are calling him two-tier Keir, accusing him of policing Britain's white majority more strictly than its ethnic minorities. Keir Starmer was the chief public prosecutor during the last set of riots in 2011. He oversaw the prosecution of thousands of people, tough action designed to quell the unrest quickly. This time around as Prime Minister, he looks to be sticking to the same strategy. Thousands have been arrested, hundreds charged, and some already sentenced.
Over 400 people now have been arrested, 100 have been charged, some in relation to online activity, and a number of them are already in court.
But many on the right are accusing the government of creating a two-tier police system. They say those attending anti-immigration demonstrations are being treated more violently and receiving more severe punishments than other protesters. It's been stoked by those on the right, including Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK.
I have had nothing to do with any form of street violence now or at any point in my career.
And people aren't just being arrested for going out
this level of incitement to violence against me, which is utterly baseless.
Joining me now to discuss the policing of these riots is Shabnam Chowdhury, a former detective superintendent with the Metropolitan Police. Shabnam, welcome to the show. Welcome to Westminster Watch here. You were serving officer during the 2011 riots. Are there any characteristics or differences between what we've witnessed here in Britain in 2024 with 2011?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Yes, there were, in my personal view, policemen in 2011. If you remember rightly, that was when UK was preparing for the 2012 Olympics.
Indeed.
So there was a lot going on. There were some differences. There were also some similarity. The huge difference for me is, well, first of all, I do not condone any form of violence, but those riots in 2011 were started as a result of the shooting of Mark Duggan.
I should explain, that was in London, and I think it was in North London where he was shot, and that's where the first riot kicked off, I
Tottenham,
think.
Yes, and there was a peaceful protest that landed at Tottenham Police Station because they demanded to see a senior officer for further explanation. And I think 300 people or so were there, and it escalated into utter violence and then days of rioting and looting and some serious damage. But the difference that I sensed on that occasion and on these recent or UK-wide riots was that they were targeting anger at police. Not that that's the reason that I'm saying that that's okay, because it's not. But on this occasion, the targeting was purely at people of colour, particularly the Muslim community, faith establishments. People were signposted and incited to go to hotels where there were asylum seekers, to burn down those hotels. And what I sensed this time was an absolute fear amongst certain sections of the community who were absolutely petrified by what was actually unfolding. For me, it felt like going back to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s.
Can I ask you, do you feel people were being directed? Was it organised?
I'm not sure it was initially organised, but I do think it became far more organised in terms of people targeting those on social media, giving signposts of where to go. I don't think that certain MPs were helpful in that respect. For example, Lee Anderson is one such MP who was telling people that there were asylum seekers in a hotel. In actual fact, it turned out it was NHS nurses.
And this is Lee Anderson of the Reform Party, recently elected. Can I just ask you, first of all, about social media? Is there anything you can do about it? I mean, social media has pretty foul stuff on it, but it also allowed people like the notorious Tommy Robinson of a far-right group, far-right activists, to encourage people, spread malicious rumours. Can you see any way this can be dealt with?
Well, I think you've seen what's being unfolded in the last couple of weeks in terms of those individuals that are inciting riots, who haven't actually even attended themselves, but are directing others to attend, who have been arrested, who have been convicted, and who have been given some serious sentences, 20 months, 2 years. So it's a start. But I think what needs to be done is those major platforms like X, like Facebook, all these platforms that need to be held to account. And I think there needs some more legislation in order to be able to address that.
Just moving the subject on, one thing that is very different to the 2011 riots and the 2024 is in the aftermath of those riots, there's been a lot of talk about two-tier policing. James Cleverly, who's a leadership candidate for the Conservative Party, but more importantly, a former Home Secretary, he said, it's important to tackle the issue of two-tier policing because of concerns over differential policing responses to differential communities, ethnic groups, too many times, and that the police forces need to tackle it. Is there two-tier policing?
No, I think this was brought about by protagonists like, for example, as you've just mentioned, Tommy Robinson. This came about after the Black Lives Matters movement, after certainly the last 7-8 months around the pro-Palestinian marches, where the far right feel that those protests have been dealt with completely different.
Could I pick you up on the far right there? Because we actually have interviewed a lot of people in the streets, and there was a sense that there was two-tier policing, but people didn't necessarily understand it, and I certainly wouldn't have described them as far right. So let me ask you your opinion on this. You mentioned the Black Lives Matters. Now, in fact, that came about during COVID. There were very tough restrictions on the whole country about gatherings and groupings. Yet in London, we saw, for example, Black Lives Matters people grouping, gathering, breaking every COVID rule you could, and the police stood by and were chatting with them. And they weren't arrested. They weren't followed up. And yet, of course, we're singling out, for many people's view, white working class English people and going in pretty hard on them. That's what I think people think is two-tier policing.
Well, I think
that fair?
there were a number of arrests that were actually made during the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think if you look at what's been going on in the last few years, let me give you an example of where social media and video footage sends out misinformation. So there was an emergency pro-Palestinian march midweek, and there was video footage shown by of officers running away, as how it was described.
Are you talking about Leeds?
No, I'm talking about London.
London.
I'm talking
Okay.
about London, sorry. And these officers were seen to be running away. So the far right picked up on this, they ran with it, and they basically said that this was two-tier policing. In actual fact, what had actually happened was that there were some breakaway groups outside near Parliament, and those officers were being directed towards that area.
But that isn't the example I gave you. I talked about what was, frankly, a relatively peaceful gathering at the Black Lives Matters groups, and they were allowed to do it. They were breaking the law, they were allowed to do it. And people are saying, look, you do it for one community group, but not for another. So there is a perception by some, and I don't believe it's all far right. I hear you. You're saying it is, I think. But if there is a perception, was Neil Basu right to, and of course he's a former head of UK counter-terrorism, was he right to dismiss former Home Secretary Priti Patel's concerns that basically she's talking divisive and absolute nonsense? Do you think that's a way to deal with a problem of perception of two-tier policing?
Well, look, there is a perception, but it needs, the reality is completely different. And no, I don't think he was wrong to make that suggestion. I think if you look at what happened with Suella Braverman in the Armistice Day, where she referred to, people coming to the cenotaph and causing damage. And then basically she called upon the far right and the likes of Tommy Robinson to come along, which then created further disorder amongst those sections of different groups. And there were a number of arrests made there as well.
But would you agree that when black communities in the UK essentially, to paraphrase, said at a time of difficult relations between the black community and the police, they said, look, we believe that the police have a differential treatment, as they would describe it, and that they, the black people, were the net losers in that treatment, I, for one, believe that's how they felt. Home Secretary James Cleverly, former Home Secretary, said that's how he felt. And it would have been a strange response to say to those communities, actually, look, there's nothing to see here.
Well, there is factual evidence of that in actual fact. If you look at policing across the UK, there's a number of forces that have been labelled institutionally racist. You saw some information today that came out around the stop and search agenda, where black people are more likely to be stopped and searched, where young children are 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police officers.
You'll have to give me, for time reasons only, Shabnam Chowdhury. Thank you very much indeed for talking us through the perceptions of two-tier policing and, of course, the contrast in the riots 2011 and 2024.
Thank you.
The riots have been blamed on long-ignored discontent amongst Britain's white working class, but they were inflamed by social media, which is increasingly where people get their news from. Here's an explainer from journalist Matt Capon about the role social media played in causing the unrest.
What we saw following the tragic events in Southport was a mobilisation and an engagement with social media that saw the extreme right wing proliferate messages that brought people out onto the streets and inflamed anger and tensions across communities nationwide. However, what we can say about this content is that it was drawn across 3 key strands which can be identified by 3 key characteristics: visceral content, behavioural content, and reflective content. Now, by visceral content, we mean content that is designed to provoke, to create strong emotional reactions. These are the messages that you see from the likes of Tommy Robinson that are designed to inflame racial tensions. Behavioural content is designed for wider communities of activists to engage with the material, to participate and amplify content. We see people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk participate and engage with these discussions and amplify these messages. However, it's reflective content which really draws the division across social media, where people are put in a position of them versus us. This comes together and creates the very vociferous and toxic atmosphere on social media. This is where we now see social media sitting, and we have to combat misinformation, because misinformation that works across these 3 strands provides really big challenges for the likes of the police and the government. Today, moving forward, we've seen an increased amount of attention on social media, but what happens next, only time will tell.
People online may seem to be more divided than ever, but what about in the real world? We stepped out of the office to see what the great British public actually thinks.
I think it's all complete rubbish. People should live their own lives, and I don't want to know what people's eating for their breakfast. I don't want photos of their food. I don't want to put myself on Facebook to say I'm on holiday somewhere so I'll get robbed. It's a complete poisonous thing, and I don't use it.
I think it contributes because it spreads messages wider and faster than a newspaper would in days gone by. I'm not sure it wasn't already there. I just think it's quicker.
There needs to be an increased awareness about what effect social media has on your daily thinking. But with that awareness, it's in the public's hands as opposed to whoever's doing it, because all they're doing is their job, which is to create social media.
And I'm pleased to say, here with me now to discuss these issues are Lee Jasper, a former policy director for policing and equalities and a former deputy mayor of London, with, alongside him, Albie Amankona, a broadcaster and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. Gentlemen, welcome. Perhaps I could start with you, Albie. As the dust settles on the riots that plagued this country, tough jail sentences are being dished out. We're all aware of that. But look, is there anything else we should be hearing from the government in respect of their response to these riots?
First of all, I would question whether or not the dust has truly settled from the riots that we saw a couple of weeks ago. There is the issue that we have, of course, with jail and sentencing. We do know that the jails are overcrowded. We've actually just heard today news that they're going to be using prison cells as opposed to actually jail cells, so these are prison cells on local high streets across the country because the jail cells are so full. So I don't think the dust has settled from these riots whatsoever, and there's actually quite a big impact on the criminal justice system overall. So in terms of what the government, I think, needs to be doing more, is actually talking about some of the causes that might be a little bit uncomfortable for them to speak about.
What would you say they are?
I think a lot of people in this country are very unhappy with their lives. A lot of people think that they get their paycheck at the end of the month and there's too much money going out and not enough money going in. They feel that immigration is too high, and they feel that the problems, the reasons that they're unhappy with their lives in this country are due to immigrants rather than the politicians that we see in this
Whipped
country.
up by some politicians?
Absolutely. They have been whipped up by not just politicians, but also influencers.
OK. Lee, let me turn to you, because in a way it picks up exactly on what Albie has been saying. Mel Stride, the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the Conservative one, who now wants to be leader of the party, he was quoted very recently saying, "The riots have shown that white working-class boys feel distance from society." He's basically arguing that the unrest took place against a backdrop of no job security, no home ownership, feeling out of reach. This is disadvantaged people. He's right, isn't he? And what do you think should be done about that?
It's absolutely right, insofar as if this was a riot involving black communities, Asian communities, we would be talking about disadvantage, long-term unemployment and poverty. There are no differences here in relation to the outbursts of violence in the north. What we have is communities and cities in the north that have been fundamentally alienated and lied to by everybody, all sides, all political sides, have promised the gain of levelling up, of more investment.
Do you think it's just the north? I mean, we had
Well,
scenes down in Surrey and Aldershot.
I think the seaside towns are equally, can be compared to the towns in the north in terms of the dramatic drop in their economies. So we've got seaside towns that are not faring well, whether it's Blackpool, Southport and others, but also here, down south. There are some that are comparable. So I think that there is a particular case about the north, and I'm from the north, so I'm passionate about it, where we've had large-scale austerity and unemployment since the 1980s. It's been that long. And the consequence of that has been destroyed communities, alcoholism, criminality, drug addiction, and in essence,
Can I just press you on one point on that? Because I was looking this up, but we all remember the Toxteth riots in Liverpool back in, early days of Margaret
81.
Thatcher's time. They were talking about 40, 50% unemployment then. We haven't got that level of unemployment.
Well, you have in the north, because you've got in the north, you have. I'm from Manchester, and there's areas of Oldham and Rochdale where families have no living memory of anybody being in employment at all. We're talking about long-term unemployment that was started in the 80s, and then those cities have never really recovered. So you've got almost 40 years, 6 generations of people in those areas where economic opportunity, the value and dignity of work, has not been available to them because of the long-term collapse in manufacturing and the lack of industrial strategy.
So what's the answer, Albie? I mean, look, the Conservatives were in power for 14 years. Some could say they've been responsible for some of the problems we've seen today. But what is the answer? Is it to do a sort of post-Toxteth invest in Liverpool, which now is transformed as a city? I'm not saying directly because of that, but it's been transformed. What is the answer that the government should be talking about?
Well, I think the first point I would make is that unemployment is lower now than it was in the 1980s, and that is just a fact. That doesn't necessarily mean that all communities have felt the benefits from unemployment coming down and economic growth being better, but unemployment is lower now than it was in the 1980s. That's an important point to make. What do we do next? I think that is quite a big question. We have clearly got to look quite closely at how disinformation was able to spread as quickly as it was, and actually also tackle the scourge of racism within our society. But also, the new government has got to be focused on spreading economic opportunity across the country for all people, not just white working class people. I think these arbitrary dividers of race aren't very helpful. Black working class, Asian working class, white working class all face the same struggles. We've got to focus on improving the quality of life for everyone.
Many of the, we're going to move the subject on a little bit now. Many of the narratives that you hear post-riots, Lee, are that people weren't being listened to, is one thing. And that was one of the reasons they took to the streets, in this case on immigration. but they also felt they were being treated differently. White working class English, two-tier policing. Do you think two-tier policing has existed?
No, I think that's absolute rubbish. I think any academic study of policing and its impact upon communities in the United Kingdom is going to show absolutely overwhelmingly that Black and Asian people are massively disproportionately policed.
So you think
Both
there's two-tier policing, but not against white working class English?
Precisely. So what the figures actually show us is that, you know, if you're Black or Asian, you're many more times to be experiencing police disproportionate use of power. The issue of racial profiling, the Baroness Casey review, all reveal the reality of British policing. So there is two-tier policing,
I don't
but it's
think
not
anyone's.
of the
I don't
counter.
think anyone's going to disrespect many of the issues, particularly with the Black community and the police. But let me ask you this, Albie. Bottom line is, Black Lives Matter riots, Black Lives Matter demonstrations and protests during COVID, gatherings in London, outside Downing Street in some cases, broke every rule book that there was. The law had been made, you weren't meant to gather. And yet the police stood by and chatted with them. That, to some people, is, hang on, white working class, they're getting harsher sentences, the police coming down on them, but they don't with Black Lives Matter.
But they're not getting
protests.
harsher sentences. Come on,
I
please.
think it's quite lazy to compare
Absolutely.
the BLM protests in
Dear,
2020 and the riots that we saw a couple of weeks
No,
ago.
it's-
There were not people trying to burn down places of worship
No, there
and
weren't.
attacking.
What about
Hang on,
Leeds,
I'm going
then?
to.
Well, you've answered the point well, but what
well.
about Leeds? So we can keep that going. What about Leeds, where people say the police walked away?
Well, that was a
from
Roma community.
Exactly, but walked away from another community, turned their backs on them and walked away. How would you say that doesn't... You see, it's the perception I'm getting
Of course
at.
it's a perception, and the point I was going to make was I felt that the way the police handled the Sarah Everard vigil on Clapham Common during the pandemic versus the Black Lives Matter protest during the pandemic, I thought that was appalling. The amount of force used on mostly women who were attending a vigil for another woman
So
who
do
had
you
been killed
agree
by a
there is
police officer.
two-tier
So I
policing
think
then?
in those two specific cases during the pandemic, you can say the police responded very differently to them. What I don't agree with is people making these lazy connections between the riots that we saw a couple of weeks ago, which is much better compared to the riots in 2011 than things that happened during the pandemic, which are nothing like the riots that we saw a few weeks ago.
Just pick you up, because you make a fair point about the comparison between Black Lives Matter protests and what went on in Southport and elsewhere.
But it's that framing that has misled working class communities.
We're here to explore that. So
Well,
let
well,
me
let's
just
explore it
press
then.
you, though. No, let me just
Okay.
press you on the Black Lives Matters one.
Go.
Because nobody was charged there, really, were they, for breaking all those COVID laws? But yet you had people with a cup of coffee walking in a national park being told by the police that they would be charged.
But
and
the
could be
two-tier
charged.
policing, it extends all the way to
hang
number
on,
10 Downing
hang on,
Street, who were
hang on.
partying and
does it
breaking
exist or
COVID
doesn't it?
rules.
And what should we do about the perception, Lee?
Well, I think the perception can be changed by virtue of education. And in fact, if you look at the reality of policing in this country, Albie's right. I think there's far too lazy comparisons in relation
But
to
what should we
one
do about
protest.
it?
Well, I think you've got to educate people out of their misunderstanding. They're not being policed in a two-tier system. There's an ethnic penalty when you go to court if you're Black and ethnic minority, even if we have no convictions between us.
But hang on, on one hand you're saying it exists for one
You said you wanted
community
to
and not another.
explore
What
it.
shall we do about it?
You said you wanted to explore it, but you're not allowing us to explore it. What you're doing is continually framing it in a default and
I've just
definite
asked you what
setting.
we're going to do about it,
And you're
Lee.
interrupting me when I'm giving you the answer.
Well, you were talking about two-tier policing
Well,
against ethnic
absolutely.
communities.
You said what we could
So
do
what
about it.
should we do?
Well, what we can do about it, as I was saying, is we can enter and ensure that communities are completely aware and understand about the realities of policing and its impact upon
Do you mean
communities.
all our communities?
Why not all our communities?
So our white working class communities?
White working class communities are disproportionately subject to some crimes and not the others.
So should we include everyone and not just split it down to different communities?
Nobody is not included when you're talking about tackling crime or enforcing the law.
I'm talking about the perception of two-tier policing.
And what I'm saying is people have got the perception because they're being misled by media pundits who are misframing the question, media who continually run their racial biases and stereotypes.
Is James
instead of
Cleverly
reporting.
a media type? The former Home Secretary, has said there is a perception of two-tier policing. It should be addressed by the police. So withstanding what Lee said, is James Cleverly right?
Of course, there are perceptions of two-tier policing, whether or not it's from the Black community, as Lee was talking about earlier on, whether or not it's from the white working class community, whether or not it's from the Muslim community. Lots of people feel they are treated differently by the police. Women, LGBTQ people,
Absolutely.
everyone has a gripe. The question is, does the evidence back it up?
Absolutely.
And if the evidence does back it up, we've got to work hard to close those disparities.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here today on Westminster Watch. We could have clearly gone on for some time with that, but time is against us. Albi Amakona, thank you very much for joining us here. Lee Jasper, good to see you. Thanks again indeed to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.